Welcome to Guy Code, a podcast dedicated to imparting dad wisdom to my son, with your host, Koji Steven Sakai, and friends.
Welcome. This is Koji, and this is episode number 32. I wanted to impart all my wisdom to my son, but of course, my son already thinks he knows more than me. So instead of trying to tell him now and having it go in one ear and out the other ear, I decided to record them here with the hopes that maybe, just maybe, when he's ready, he'll listen to my advice in the future and not make the same stupid mistakes that I did. I'll also bring on guests to impart their advice as well. I have no doubt that my guests will have better advice than mine. This week, I brought on writer, photographer, foodie, social media guy, and speaker on all Asian American Pacific Islander topics, and king of the grill, right? Gil Asakawa. Gil, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
It's funny because my co-host on my other podcast, Best or Worst podcast, is an aspiring grill master. So when I saw that, I had to include that because apparently everyone around me is a grill master.
Yeah, you know what it is? I'm an instinctual cook. I kind of cook like my mom used to cook. You know, she didn't measure things out. She'd just throw things on, and when I'm grilling, I just kind of know when it's ready. I don't think I follow all the rules. I don't know. I cook like I do a lot of things. I go with my gut.
That's funny. One time I tried to learn cooking from my mom, and I got really frustrated because she'd just be like, "Just do a little of this." And I was like, how much though? I don't know how much, like, I don't know what to do. And she's like, just do this. And I'm like, it's not helpful because I can't recreate it because I don't know, like I don't have the specific,
amounts.
There's no recipe. Yeah. So it's
the
like,
ratio. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it never tasted right. But Gil, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, sure. I live in Denver, Colorado. And I am a journalist by trade. I went to art school. I thought I was going to be an artist for Marvel Comics because when I was a kid, I used to collect Marvel Comics. Of course, when I went to college, my mom threw out my collection. Oh my God, is that so bad? You know, she threw out a lot of stuff. But I thought I would become an artist, you know, working for Marvel. And when I was in college, I started writing music reviews. I got involved in the college radio station, campus radio station. This is in the mid-1970s, so the era of punk rock. And I was the one guy from Colorado. There are a couple of us from Colorado, but I was the one on the radio station from Colorado. So it's a little embarrassing now, but I used to call myself the, quote, teriyaki cosmic cowboy. And I played country rock. I played basically what's today called alt country, you know, folk rock and country rock. And that's what I played on the radio because everybody else was playing, you know, progressive rock and punk. And I played some punk and stuff too, but I did a lot of stuff on the radio station. Then I started getting involved with this publication that was published in college papers across the country, and it was an entertainment insert called Ampersand. And I don't remember how I found out about it, but I sent them a review of a guy named Steve Forbert, his first album, which I loved. It was called Alive on Arrival, kind of a folk rock singer-songwriter guy, and they ran it. And they had my name on the review, and they sent me a check the following week. I'm like, holy moly, I can get paid to write this stuff. You know, I'd been a music fan when I was younger because I read Rolling Stone cover to cover. I knew that this kid, Cameron Crowe, who wrote a lot of the articles I liked and interviewed people that I liked, I knew that he was like my age. And I'm like, I can't believe this kid's writing in Rolling Stone. I could do that. And, you know, later they did the movie Almost Famous about him. Yeah, because Cameron Crowe became a writer, director, producer, and all this stuff, and married one of the Hart sisters. And Cameron Crowe was kind of a hero. And then I also knew, what's his name? The editor, Rolling Stone editor, who was Chinese American.
Oh yeah.
And I met him like in the 80s a couple of times, and he's a cool guy. And I knew that for some reason, all right, what's his name? How come
I forget.
This is what happens. This is what happens when you get old, right? Editor, Ben Fong Torres. Thank you.
That's right.
Ben Fong Torres. He wrote a great book called The Rice Room about growing up with parents who ran a Chinese restaurant in San Francisco. And he became a writer and a music writer, and he was in California, in San Francisco at the right time, and fell in with all the initial Rolling Stone guys. And I knew because of his name that he was Asian. I may have seen a picture of him too, but it turns out that he's Filipino American, Filipino Chinese American, or Chinese. No, he's Chinese American, but his family was in the Philippines. And so his father bought fake passports, fake identification with the last name Torres, which is why the name is hyphenated, Fong Torres. Because if you were Filipino, you could immigrate to the U.S. from the Philippines. But if you were Chinese, you could not at the time, because the Chinese Exclusion Act was still in force. So his family came to San Francisco and so on and so forth. And I knew that he was Asian. I knew that he wrote for Rolling Stone, and he was one of my role models too. So I started writing about music, and I wrote for this publication, Ampersand, while I was in art school. And of course, when I got out of art school, I didn't do art, much to my parents' chagrin, since they paid for an expensive college education. So a lesson for you, if your parents pay for your college education, follow their lead. If you want to do whatever you want to do, which is what I actually would counsel you to do, be honest and say, you can pay for this if you want. I may not become a doctor. But, Koji, given your background, something tells me you're not forcing doctor, lawyer, pharmacist,
actually,
engineer.
It's actually funny. I'd prefer my son to be one of those than writer. Because it's tough, right? It's a tough business.
Tough.
It's a tough business to get into, and
it's a tough business to make a living in.
Yeah, and being a doctor is, at least they'll always need some form of a doctor.
Man, you sound like so many Asian parents.
Yeah, yeah. It's just a struggle. It's just, if you're willing to fight, if you're willing to do it and fight through all that stuff, then for sure. But most people aren't,
yeah.
So it's just easier not to go down that path. But thank you. Yeah, that was awesome.
So when I got out of college,
yeah.
I worked at a menial retail job at a paint store, but I became a writer for the Boulder, Colorado Daily, which is a college kind of a paper. And I covered music and art for them, and it was a cool time. And then from there, I went to Denver's alternative weekly newspaper, Westward, and I wrote music stuff for them for a couple of years until they hired me as music editor. The dream job, right, for a music fan who likes to write. I did that. I wrote news stories. I did all sorts of stuff like that for years. I wrote for other newspapers. I wrote for Rolling Stone magazine. Got to do that. And so I became a journalist kind of by falling into it. And then the internet thing happened. And since the 1990s, I've been involved in online jobs. So I've been really lucky. This is my first tip for young people, which is know what you're good at, follow your passion, and be the best at that thing that you're passionate about, whether it's, social activism or cutting up frogs, whatever. You can either be a mortician or you can be a doctor, but be the best at whatever you're passionate about. And then if you put yourself in the way of that pathway, that road something will come down the road and you can hitch a ride on it, because I swear to you, every job I've managed to get, I've kind of fallen into by something I was passionate about, including the Asian American stuff that I do now. I mean, I just started writing a blog because I like to write and I have opinions, and I'm interested in my identity as a Japanese American. And it turned into a book. The publisher contacted me and said, "Hey, you write a blog about being Japanese American. Would you like to write a book about being Japanese American?" That was my book, Being Japanese American.
Yeah.
So these things, if you really focus on what you care about and you become really good at it, people will notice and things will happen for you. That's my first big tip.
Well, so let me ask you a question. How do you find what you're passionate about? How would you recommend going about that? Or is this something that you think that people already know, or that they're just not dealing with or paying attention to?
That's an interesting question. I guess I've always assumed that people know what they're into. And I mean, you know, maybe I'm betraying my age here, but maybe it's, you know, video games, computer games. But you know, if you spend all your time as a gamer and you really become really good at it, for one thing, you can become a competitive gamer now.
Yeah.
And make a living at that, find sponsors.
You can make a really good money, actually.
Yeah. And yeah, you should push them in this direction. But also, you know, maybe you can become a coder, you can become a programmer, you can actually help design games and or do you know, I don't know, check games for flaws, and I don't know. So I think if you think about the things that make you happy, you'll know that that's something, you know, then there might be 3 or 4 things, but you'll know if you could kind of explore each one. It seems like you would know which one is the one that you can really focus on and become known for.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of times people already know, but they're trying to push it away for whatever reason. You know, like I can't make a living as a writer, or I can't make a living as an actor or a musician or whatever it is. And then they're just like, it's not a reasonable career. So like, even for myself, you know, I knew I wanted to be a writer when I was 13 or 14, but you know, like I thought I needed a real job. I thought, you know, like I didn't, like no one in my life was a writer. I couldn't even point to a single person. And there weren't a lot of Asian American writers, you know, that I knew, at least at that time.
Yeah.
And so, you know, thinking about, like, for me, like, I remember it always kept coming back to writing because that was something I was passionate and something that I was meant to do. But you know, one of my biggest regrets was not just being at like 14, well, this is what I want to do, and just really spending, you know, a lot of time perfecting and getting better. But it took a long time to kind of come around to that, I think.
Well, you know, I think I would have to admit that when I was 14, like I said before, I thought I was on a path to become an artist at Marvel Comics. You just never know. I mean, I went to art school. I was really good, I have to say, if I say so myself. I was really good at drawing and painting, and I actually changed my major from like illustration to fine arts. So I have a BFA, Bachelor of Fine Arts, in painting. And I worked the last couple of years in New York City, which is where I went to art school. I worked in one of the top galleries in Greenwich Village, in Soho, actually, and nationally known gallery. And so I was really on this path to do art stuff. And then somewhere along my senior year, I thought, you know what? A lot of these people in the art world, they're kind of phony. I don't really like them, because I was meeting a lot of people, you know, famous people that are being written about in magazines. And I thought, I don't really like them. And, you know, they're just getting big shows because they're kissing up to gallery owners and the right collectors. And I thought, nah, you know what? I like this stuff I'm doing for ampersand, writing about music. So I'm going to try to do that. And boy, were my parents mad when I did that. So I think you have to be willing to be flexible,
yeah,
and adjust when something else comes, you know, falls into your lap, and realize, oh, cool. Maybe I should do this.
Yeah. Excellent. That sounds like awesome advice. Do you have what's your other, some other advice you might have?
Well, it has to do with the writing part. You
Okay.
got to read a shitload of stuff. You got to be able to write well, and not just text, because it's the foundation of communication is to write and have a not a mastery even, but at least understand and know English grammar, punctuation. As a copy editor and an editor, it drives me nuts when writers don't know some of the really basic fundamentals. And I think you have to be a good writer before you can be a good writer. I mean, you have to be a good writer before you can have a success in almost anything, because it's the basis of communication. And I feel like you have to read, like with college students. I worked at the University of Colorado for the last 10 years in the journalism department. I would ask even the guys that want to be men and women who think they want to become music critics. I'd ask them, well, who do you like to read? Who's your favorite music critic? And they wouldn't really have one. I think if you want to be a good writer, you have to have favorite good writers. They can be novelists, they can be playwrights, they can be script writers. When you see somebody's name on a movie, you go, oh, cool, I know it's going to be good. If you have favorites, comic books, man, I had my favorite writers and artists from comic books. And if you have favorites, you'll find yourself emulating them. And if you emulate good ones, you'll find yourself getting better and better. And eventually you might start. When I began as a music critic, I totally copied a couple of my favorite music critics. There's a guy named Robert Christgau at the Village Voice in New York. And now I look back on all my early writing and it sounds really pompous. It's because I was trying to be Robert Christgau, and then eventually you kind of develop your own voice. So you read a lot of stuff, you write a lot of stuff, and eventually your own voice will develop. I think that's really an important tip.
Yeah. I'm always surprised by how illiterate people sound when they write, and how it's so terrible, and that they can't even put words together. I always joke that I'm able to put two words together, but other people, it's something that's really, it's really sad, especially when, I always think it's funny when there are, haters online, or, and they write something, you're like, you didn't even spell it correctly. You didn't even the fact that you didn't put the right comma may change the entire meaning of what you just said,
No,
you totally ruined it. So it's, yeah. And then the reading thing is important. I mean, I think that have people who, what I always enjoy about, when I was in college, I remember thinking this too, was I had a lot of friends who were like, the moment I'm out of college, I'm going to start reading. And I'm like, I don't know. You're not reading now. You didn't read before. Why after college? You think you can have all this time? Because I read during college. I'd read regular books during college. And it's just, something I did regularly because I've always been a reader.
Yeah.
But then they were like, and then after college, of course they didn't start reading, right? It's like,
no.
you don't just suddenly start reading, but it's that thing where the more you read, the better you get. One of the things I teach, because I teach screenwriting as well, is I teach a lot about how, the best way to tell an actor how to say the dialogue is through the punctuation, right? Comma's a half stop, a period's a full stop, and multiple, and you don't need to do fancy things. Just learn how to use punctuation. And the more you learn how to use punctuation, the better you'll be as a writer, and then it blows their mind because they'd never considered
Well, I think that's partly that's because I think people take writing, they're scared of writing.
Yeah.
Right? When they have to write something, a lot of people get really uptight and go, oh my God, I have to write a 2-page paper. I'm sorry, I can write a 2-page paper in about 15 minutes. You just sit down and you just vomit out on the keyboard. And I think the key is exactly what you just said in terms of punctuation. I tell young writers always, if you want to be a better writer, you have to write conversationally. And to be a conversational writer, you have to understand the dynamics of punctuation. When people pause, how long of a pause is that? what's the meaning that you're conveying?
Yeah.
And I feel like if people get really caught up in the rules, and I think grammar is super important. Copy editing and punctuation, all that stuff, super important. But also, you're allowed to break the rules in the name of art, and that's maybe something I got from art school.
That's awesome. All right, I'd love to hear more advice if you have any more advice.
One is, again, this kind of goes to being a writer or a journalist, and I bet as you too, as a storyteller, be curious. Be curious about people you meet, cultures you cross, food that's presented to you. Be curious about everything, the world, because that'll give you a fuller understanding of where you fit in that world. I think that's so important. And seriously, I think a lot of the problems with the US right now, our society, is that I bet most of these people who are saying dumb stuff have never traveled outside of the US, I feel like they don't know the world. They don't know where we fit in the world.
Well, it's like when people, who they hear people speaking like Spanish or something, and they get mad that you're speaking Spanish, and then they go to a foreign country and speak English, right? They speak English, and you're like, whoa, like it doesn't go both ways. Or they speak louder English, actually.
Yeah.
And they're like, but you're in France, like, you're in Japan.
It always cracks me up when Americans, non-Nihonjin, let's say, Hakujin, white people, are in Japan, and you can tell that they're like the first time negotiating the cultural differences. And instead of, speaking slowly to Japanese, because most Japanese know some English. I mean, they were raised learning some English in grade school. Instead of speaking slowly, they'll just speak louder. Like that's going to help them be more clear. Can you tell me where I go to Shinjuku? Come on.
Yeah, but I love the advice of being because I call it being a student of the world. Students always ask me, how do you come up, like how does one come up with ideas? As first thing I say is get out of the office, get out of your room, because like I'm constantly listening to podcasts, I'm constantly reading, I'm constantly on Facebook. Even 2 of my TV ideas actually came from people posting stuff on Facebook, and I'm like, oh hey, that's interesting, I never knew that. And then I started doing research, or back when we could be outside and stuff, I used to talk to people at Starbucks and just get to know them and be like, hey, that's a really interesting story, I've never and I think that like a lot of people who are writers especially, they feel like the only way to become a writer is kind of magically these things come into you, but but you're right. It's like it's about being open to new ideas and interacting and listening and reading and
being
learning.
Curious.
Yeah, exactly. Being curious. I think so.
I love talking to people. Actually, one of my favorite things is I don't go to Starbucks very often, but in a coffee shop other than Starbucks, I'll sit there and I love, or in the airport, my favorite place to do this. I love sitting there and looking at people and wondering what their lives are like. What do they do for a living? And I'm always doing that. And if I get a chance to meet people, I love asking them, so where'd you grow up? And, it's not like with Asians hearing, where do you come from? Or where are you from? You speak English so good.
Yeah.
No, I'm curious to know what forms people's backgrounds.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. And one side story. One of my friends, he was in college. He was a jerk. He was a really not good guy. But his grandfather passed away, and his grandfather is super wealthy, like generationally wealthy. And his grandfather did not like his grandson, and so his stipulation on getting a bunch of money was that he had to travel alone around the world for 6 months. And he had to like prove it, that he was alone and that he didn't go with anybody. And that, and he had to go to all the continents, and there's like all these stipulations. And I remember when he came back, he was a totally different guy. Like he was
awesome.
He was a way better guy, because he just had perspective. I mean, when you spend, like he spent like a summer in Vietnam, and he said all these places and these different places. And I think it just opened his eyes in a way that, being kind of stuck in his hometown and being the wealthy guy in that town really kind of closed him off to the world. You know, he went around and he fell in love and he fell out of love and he met new friends and he saw new cultures where he's a Caucasian guy, where he wasn't a dominant dude, and realizing, just understanding what that's like. And it just changed his entire, and I just remember that being like, wow, that trip transformed him, right? And he only lost like a year of school, which is fine. He went back to school and did his thing. But you know, I remember that was like, and he hated in the beginning. He didn't want to do it, but
of course.
But I was like, hey, dude, this is a lot of money. Like, I'll do it.
Yeah.
You know, like,
that you know, that's what comes with privilege. You know, ethnic and economic privilege, that you don't feel like you have to have empathy for anybody else in the world.
Yeah.
Sounds familiar with our guy in the White House.
Like our current president.
Yeah, exactly. And then to piggyback on that part about being curious, you've been to Japan.
Yeah.
You've been to Japan.
My mom's Japanese. My mom's Japanese.
Okay.
Yeah.
Has your son been to Japan?
No, not yet. We were planning to go, but then.
How old is he?
8 years old.
8. Oh, dude, you're going to have so much fun when you go to Japan because you'll be aware. You'll notice things.
Yeah.
But travel to Japan, especially for Japanese Americans, I think it's super important because I know a lot of Japanese Americans that don't feel connected to Japan.
Yeah.
The number one reason I've gotten from people is, well, you know, I don't speak Japanese and I'll be uncomfortable. I don't want to be embarrassed. And no, you know, white people go to Japan and yell all the time. You know, so you don't have to know Japanese to get by in Japan. Yeah. And I really urge Japanese Americans to go, because I swear every time I go back to Japan, and I was born there, and I moved when I was 8 years old to the US with my family. And so I have this awareness, a child's perspective on Japan, but every time I go to Japan, even today, and we were there family trip last October, so pre-COVID, I feel like I find a new piece of myself with every trip, and I reconnect with things I didn't even know that I had been connected to. I think that's so important for us to go to Japan and be curious and be open-minded and embrace everything and try everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had an interesting relationship with Japan, in that, because my mom is from Japan, so I speak Japanese, and I've been to Japan a lot when I was a kid. And I remember my mom kept telling me that I was Japanese, and then I go to Japan and be like,
they say you're not
Japanese, and they're really, and not rude, because Japanese people aren't rude, right? But like, if you know the culture, you know that they're not being nice either, right? Like on the surface, it's very nice, but in reality, it's like they're kind of being rude. And I just remember
they're laughing at you.
Yeah, they're laughing at me, and they're being really just. I mean, I had a really tough time in school because I went to school in the summers and stuff.
Okay.
There, and I just had a really, really. But also, like, Japan back then was different. Now it's a lot more diverse. I mean, diverse in Japan's terms. I mean, and you know,
exactly.
They're a lot more open. Like, I see Hapa, I see Africans, I see European. I see a lot more people. Like back in the day, it was like literally only Japanese. I was the weird person because I wasn't Japanese American. I was Japanese American, right? But I you know, so it is interesting. But I've always felt really well connected to Japan. But I wonder how it would feel like for my son or other people, like for him because he's not, because obviously we're Japanese Americans, so he doesn't have that same. So I think it would be really good for him to see, you know, that dynamic and how it feels, and you know, to be a majority too, right? To be like part of the walk
off the plane. It's like being in Hawaii. You walk off the plane and you're no longer the minority population.
Yeah. I mean, like, I love, you know, like I love when I go to Japan, I feel like I could eat at any restaurant and not be worried, because like every food feels familiar, even if it's not, even if I've never had it before, you know. Which is different than when I go to like any other country. Well, maybe America, but you know, any other country, it's like, it's like, you never know, right? Like you just never, I'm not sure, I don't know. But everywhere I go in Japan, I'm like, oh yeah, like my mom made something like this at some point, or my aunt made something like this, or, you know. But yeah, I think you know, I was surprised when I started working at the Japanese American National Museum about how non-Japanese the Japanese Americans were. Because again, like I was raised by I'm Yonsei technically, and like I was.
You think like a Nisei.
I'm more of like a Nisei, yeah. And so when I look at them, I'd like, wait, what? Like, even like, what are you talking about? Like, that's not Japanese, And
Yeah.
and then also the idea that like I used to joke that I'd root for Japan and the United States in the Olympics.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Ultimately,
Me too.
but like for Japanese Americans, especially the older generation, they wouldn't. That would be like uncalled. Like they could never do that because of camps and stuff, right? And
Yeah.
and so I find that really, this, and I think that that's honestly one of the issues with the community is that we feel so disconnected with where our ancestors were at some
Yeah.
point in the past.
I think it's the trauma still that haunts us. When I was a kid, I was 6 years old during the Tokyo Olympics, and in 1964 on black and white TV, and it was a big deal. We lived in Tokyo. My dad took us on the first Shinkansen rides. The Shinkansen train were unveiled like 2 weeks before the Olympics, and so my dad took us to I think Osaka and back, and no, not Osaka, Yokohama and back. It was a short trip, but it was a big deal. And because of that, I've always rooted for Japan in all the sports as well as the U.S. So I don't know, but sorry to take up so much time, but here's a story about being Japanese American in Japan. A lot of times after a while, Japanese people will tell me, "Oh, your Nihongo is very good," and I'll say, "Yeah, domo, but I was 8 when I moved, so I have the vocabulary of a child." And I said, "But I think my accent is pretty good."
Yeah.
Accento. And so I'd get cocky. And one time I was at Asakusa, and I paid my cab driver who dropped me off, and I said thank you, and we had been talking in Japanese about baseball and Japanese players starting to make it into the major leagues in the US. And so I got out, I was all cocky, I went to this chestnut vendor on the street by Asakusa, and I bought a 1,000 yen bag of kuri chestnuts, and he hands me the bag. I give him the money. I said, "Domo, domo," and he says, "You're welcome." And I had started walking away, and I stopped, and I turned back and said, "How did you know that I'm American?" He goes, "Feeding." So it was. He said he had a feeling because of the way I acted.
Yeah.
The way I walked, the way I was dressed, and the way I made eye contact. There are all these little signals that scream that we're American, not Japanese.
Actually, it's funny because I had that same. I was on a beach wearing swim shorts. I didn't talk to because I have an American accent, so that's why I had a tough time in Japan because I sound like a white person speaking Japanese. And so it sounds really it just sounds like, I don't really know what I'm doing. And so I remember I was on the beach. I didn't say anything to anyone. And all these kids were making fun of me. And it was just they knew I was different because like the way I walked, what I was probably wearing. I mean, I was in like swim trunks, but the way I carried myself,
Yeah.
it was
in
really,
our gait.
It's just in the way way we carry ourselves, like the way we gait, the way we talk, obviously, but it was just really like I was jealous of the white people in Japan because if they tried to speak Japanese, like that was better than me.
Jozu ne, jozu.
Whereas like if I spoke my funny Japanese, because I learned Japanese from my mom, and she left in the 60s, so I speak like a woman from the 60s.
Yes, me too. We moved in the mid 60s, and my mom, my dad was Japanese, born in Hawaii. My mom was born in Hokkaido. She's a Issei, and she still to this day speaks. Actually, the older she gets, she's in a memory care center now. She speaks almost exclusively Nihongo now. But I learned my Japanese from her, so I use feminine pronouns, like for myself, and and people sometimes will look at me funny in Japan. And
Yeah, I get a lot of
like,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, but at least your
That's
accent
funny.
sounds good. Mine sounds terrible. So it sounds like I'm a American masquerading in a Japanese body, like with a Japanese woman's body, I guess, or
Yeah,
American
right.
body. I don't know. That's hilarious.
An American woman trapped in a Japanese
There you
body.
go. Yes, there you go. Although one time I was at school, I remember this is funny. I was at school and I was being surrounded because they were all picking on me.
Mhm.
And I just remember like in America, if I'm surrounded by a bunch of kids, I'm about to get my butt kicked, right?
Yeah,
And
it's
I'm
true.
gonna get jumped. And so I thought that's what was about to happen. So I like found the biggest kid and I punched him, and which is like the anti-Japanese thing to do, right? But I punched
Yeah.
him, and then I punched another kid, and they all scattered, and I didn't know what was going on. And then my mom and my aunt got so mad at me because, like in Japan, like right, they just kind of surround you and like make fun of you and stuff. But I thought it was like because they don't like physical fights are not that common in Japan, and I was like I got so much trouble because I was like, well, I thought like they're gonna hurt me, so I wanted to get like my goal was to get two good punches in before I got like my butt kicked.
Yeah,
Mom was horrible.
that's great.
I had to go around and apologize to everybody. I was like, but they were, like they were making fun of me.
Wow. Dude, you know what? There's a script in this, right? Now I think you need to write something, a play, an episode for some TV show about culture. I don't know, but
Yeah.
there's,
It's
I
it's
mean,
it scarred me though. That all those things really scarred me. That's
yeah,
why I don't speak Japanese.
yeah.
When I'm in Japan, I speak English.
And
And
I think that's the fear of that is why a lot of Japanese Americans
yeah,
are
but I understand. But
scared.
the difference is when I get really frustrated, or then I just start talking because I'm like I can't have, like I need to get like through something. But
Yeah,
or if I'm in a meeting, when I'm in Japan in meetings, I like pretend I don't know, and then I could like listen to what they're saying.
right. That's
But
the weird part, right? Because
yeah,
we can understand about 50, 60%. We can speak about 20, 30%.
yeah, exactly. So I understand like unless we're talking about something super technical,
Yeah,
like I probably like I could watch a movie. I could like
yeah.
follow along a movie and stuff. But anyway, but yeah, I'd love to hear any other advice you have.
The last one is have empathy. You got to have empathy, especially in these times because of kind of the bullying culture, because of the division in the country. I think if you're curious, you're kind of gonna automatically have some empathy
Yeah,
because you're curious about people and you're asking them about their lives. And if you have that kind of empathy, I think it'll help you. It'll help you be a better person. Hopefully, it'll help these other people around you from beating you up. you know, and and I just think it's important. I find myself getting pissed off at times and not having much empathy for people, but ultimately, I think it's really important.
is empathy something that's learned or is it something that's innate? Both.
Uh, I think it's both. I think some people are born kind of empathetic, or born with the ability. Like, let's face it, our current president,
He has no empathy.
yeah, doesn't have the ability to even fake empathy.
Yeah,
But I think if you're open to it, I think you can learn empathy. At least you can start. It comes with being curious. You can
yeah,
start to try to understand people.
yeah. I mean, it always like drives me nuts when, for example, if we look at like gay or lesbian issues, and you hear people. I'm a Democrat, and you hear people on the right say, like it wasn't until my brother came out, or my sister came out, or my cousin, or my child, and now I'm okay with gay marriage. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I don't need anyone in my life to be gay for me to be okay with gay people getting married.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
I could already rationalize that it's not okay to say these people can't get married, when they're not really hurting anybody.
It's
But so
that's a
it is interesting, right?
Yeah, no, that's kind of a related symptom of the thing that gets people to say, "Oh no, I'm not racist. I dated a black girl once." Or
Or
yeah, I
my
have
neighbor's
friends.
black.
Yeah, I have friends who are Mexican.
Yeah.
Or the worst, and I have actually heard this. I love Mexican food. Um,
Yeah.
uh,
Or my neighbors are cool, but I don't like black people in general or something. You're just like,
Yeah, exactly. No,
like, I don't know.
they're okay. It's the ones that are on TV that, yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah. I do think a lot of our problems in this country are because we lack this basic kind of empathy for other
Hmm.
people, you know. I do think that that's like a big thing. And that's something that I try to teach my son as much as possible, is to think about what it feels like to be in another person's shoes. You know, even just being like a couple weeks ago, we were running, we're do a run every morning. And I remember, you know, we were running around in a nice neighborhood, nice part of our neighborhood. And I was like, hey, if we were black at 6 o'clock in the morning running around, we would have to be careful about what we're doing and how we look and how we act, you know. But
Yeah.
because we're Asian in a relatively Asian neighborhood, we're probably okay. But you know,
Yeah.
we have to understand that other people, like a black person running on the street, could be seen as like he's running away from something, or he's done something bad. And you know, and like, to me, that's important to understand, you know, how other people feel or how other people have gone through experiences. You know, that's why I think the camp experience is so important for Japanese Americans to keep bringing up, because
Yeah.
it's something that we could talk about. Like, look what happens when we lose that, like, Japanese Americans aren't human thing,
Right.
right? When we lose like
Exactly.
other people aren't human, like, you know, like the migrants or the undocumented people or the families and the
Yeah.
kids and stuff. You know, it's like, regardless of how we feel about immigration or, you know, illegal immigration, it's
Yeah.
still like I could still hold that thought and also be like, we shouldn't separate children from their families. We shouldn't put
No.
them in jails. You know,
I
like
mean, the thought that hundreds or even thousands of children are still, they'll probably never see their parents again. They're going to have to grow up as orphans, basically.
yeah,
That is so tragic.
yes,
Unbelievable.
yeah. Or that people
So,
get like, or you know, if you get stopped by a police officer and you're African American, that, you know, it could
yeah.
turn really badly,
Oh,
right?
man.
And
Yeah.
there's all these things, and I just wish there's more of that. I just don't know how to teach how to, you know, I wish there was a way for people to feel it. One thing I know is that especially when like Caucasians in America go to places where they're not the majority, it really, like, there's two reactions. One reaction is I don't like it. Like, that's why they don't go to
Hmm.
Africa or Asia or Latin America. Or some people are like, it kind of opens their mind in that, like,
Yeah.
wow, this is like, I've had like experiences where white people in Japan have told me, oh, this is what it feels like for you. I was like, yeah, every day of my life in America. You know,
Exactly.
like, it just feels like I'm like, even though I'm more American than them, because my dad came in, like, my dad's family came in the 1880s, and their family,
Oh,
like,
wow.
Donald Trump came in like, his family came in the 20s, right?
Yeah.
And you know, even though like my family has been here for longer, I could go to places where I'm not going to be accepted, even if I speak English perfectly and I grew up here. I
Yeah.
probably know more about history. That, you know, like, I could go down and be more American than them, but I'll never be more American than them. And I think that that's and it goes back to kind of travel and seeing
Yeah.
and understanding.
And having a wider worldview. One last anecdote about kind of this related to this sense of identity is my friends at the Denver Post, when I worked at the Denver Post, didn't believe me when I told them that when I'm walking down a hallway or a sidewalk, white people expect me to move out of the way.
Oh, really?
And oh yeah, and maybe it's different in LA because
Yeah.
there's so many more Asians. But and to prove it, on lunch we went outside and we walked up and down the 16th Street Mall. And whenever there was a group of like 2 or 3 Caucasians walking towards me on the sidewalk, they would always expect me to move out of the way
Wow.
without fail. And so over the years, I've gotten to the point where I'll just either not move out of the way and hit them, and then I'll say, "Excuse you," just to be a jerk, or I'll stop, and they'll have to move out. You know, unless they'll have to move out of the way or hit me. When we were in, my wife and I were in Hawaii. You know, it's like Japan. You walk off the plane, and all of a sudden, almost everybody looks like you. It's just a weird, wonderful feeling. And in Hawaii, you know, like a white person, it's a big white guy, would bump into you and he'd be the one that would say, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And I think it's because it has that dynamics of being the majority versus minority. And suddenly your sense of privilege has been exchanged.
Yeah.
Lost your privileges.
Yeah.
And it's so striking to us that we can see that. But most people with privilege don't see that.
Yeah. Well, I went to a school that was high school that was 65%, more than 65% Asian. So I went to a
Mm,
place where like I always felt like, even though I didn't see anybody on television or movies or anything like that,
right,
or
right.
books, I never like, I looked around and be like, well, everyone's Asian here, like, and so
Yeah,
I never had those kind of Asian American like I never felt that way. Like they should get out of my way because I'm like the
yeah.
boss. But it is interesting, Actually, and going back to empathy real quick, I wanted to share. I went on a road trip to Tule Lake. That's where my family was,
Hmm.
one of the places, and we drove through like really really rural parts of California, and it really really opened my eyes about what's going on in America, and just seeing, like, for
Hmm.
example, we were in Tule Lake and there's 3 blocks and every single store was shuttered. Not even because of
Yeah,
COVID, they're just shuttered because everyone's leaving these small towns, and just
yeah,
seeing, like, and understanding, like, oh, this is why they hate us,
yeah.
and like it was the real, I mean, I always knew, rural versus urban divides and coasts
Right.
versus, the Midwest and everything like that. But it was the first time I really, like, it was like in my face, and it really did change I'm like, okay, I get it. Like, even telling
Yeah,
my son, I was like, hey, this is, like, we might think it's boring, but they think that we're godless, so
yeah. No, actually, that's the sense of why I said it's important to travel to other countries. Not so much. It's important to travel in the U.S. too, but you know, I love road trips. But my two white fellow rock critic friends and I drove down to this thing called South by Southwest,
yeah.
which is a music and media conference in Austin, Texas. We went there for like 14 years straight, and we drove most of the time. And one time we drove down there and we pulled in for breakfast in San Antonio, Texas. And we walked in to the diner and the place became completely silent. And they were staring at us because we had one normal looking white guy, young, one older white guy with like long white hair pulled back in a ponytail, and me. And it's because of me that the entire place got really
Mhm.
quiet. We ordered basic food, we ate really fast, and we got out of there because it just felt so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So if you travel, like driving up through rural America, it's important to see that too,
Yeah.
to
Well, yeah.
understand.
This is the first year that, for example, I carried a weapon with me this year because
Oh
I just didn't,
man,
I wasn't sure. I'm not sure where
yeah.
we're going and how we were going to be, because we're wearing masks. We're Asian,
Oh,
and
that's true.
I just didn't know how people would react to just seeing us, and and like nothing happened, obviously, and
Yeah,
everything's fine. But just like, this was the first time, because I've driven across the country, I've driven all over this
yeah.
place, and it was the first time I'm like, maybe I just need to have something with me just to make sure that everything's fine
Just
at
in
the end of the day,
case.
because you never know, because people, like, it was crazy. Like, for example, actually, one quick story: we were driving through Nevada real quick, and everything, like, everybody in Nevada, like, we counted the people in masks. It was like 3 people
Oh,
in masks, right? Like, out of everybody we saw, there's 3 people in
yeah,
masks, and we were so we were like, we're just driving through. We're just gonna go all the way, because we were
yeah,
cutting across, like, we're cutting through Nevada.
yeah.
But it was really interesting to see, like, how different it was, and it's not even that. I mean, I was like, like, this was like early in our trip, so it's like 8 hours from LA. So we're not talking about like states away, right? We're talking about just like,
Yeah.
a little bit of a drive, but it was really interesting. I would love to find a way to teach empathy. I think in schools, I think if there was a way to teach empathy, I think that would be a really great way.
You can probably do it with like role playing and setting
Yeah.
up situations. What would you do? What do you think? And make people kind of confront, their own thinking process.
But do you really understand? And I think, like, for example, I think of like people of color or other minorities. I think they get it because
Yeah,
every day
for
they're
sure.
already like in kind of a situation, in an
Oh
uncomfortable
yeah,
situation where they're not the majority, or they have to be wary, like, especially if you're
yeah,
like African American or something.
yeah. You hang your identity at the door before you walk
Yeah.
in. First thing you do in a room is see who's in there,
Who's in
see if
there?
anybody like you, and
Yeah.
how am I going to act? Can I be completely myself or 40% myself, or
Yeah.
you
Well,
know?
it's always shocking. Like, even I go to like, my son goes to super progressive school, and you like, you just hear, like, I still hear it. You're like, oh wow, I thought this was a progressive, you still hear these things, and it's really surprising. And I think a lot of it's because I think it's a lot of it because people want to say that they're progressive and liberal and open, but when push comes to shove, they don't really they don't really want it or believe it. And so that's what drives me. I'd rather just have you be like a racist person and just admit it, and it's fine.
It's recommended book. Yeah, there's a great book called White Fragility.
Oh yeah.
That's about, and it applies very much to, like, I've been talking to a good friend of mine in Boulder. Boulder, Colorado is like Cambridge, Mass, or Berkeley in California, and it's this bastion of liberalism. But I think a lot of people there have white fragility because it's largely white, because of the economics. It's a largely white population, and they like to say they're progressive, and they're progressive on lots of issues, but they're not. They're scared of people of color, or they don't know people of color. They're not open to the experience of people of color, and I don't know. It's I think that's something real that's out there.
Yeah, and I think that's what the issue with our country at this point is to bridge that kind of divide. And I just don't know how or if we can actually bridge this because it was easy when one group of people was on top and everybody else was way lower. But now that there's like this, like people are demanding more than just being on the bottom. I think it's we're running into this problem that we're having now as a country, and I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. And if the election, if the Democrats win the election, we're going to have a new underclass of really angry Trump voters who might do something violent, like shoot at protesters, I'm really quite scared for that.
Yeah, no, I was hoping that things were going to get better, but I'm starting to believe that not. Actually, side note, one of my friends from Syria, he's actually sending his family back to Syria.
Oh,
because
man.
He actually told me, I was on the phone with him yesterday. He told me that he felt like he feels the same way about what's going on here that he did before in Syria before everything went down. And he's like, he could feel the tension. He walks around. I was like, hey, if you really when the moment you feel like more, please let me know. And he's like, yeah, I'm sending my family back because it just it feels very unstable right now in a really bad way. I don't know.
It could happen. Hey, what's your son's name?
Takao.
Takao.
Yeah, Takao.
You probably sent that to me in an email.
Yeah, no problem.
But
funny because it's such a hard name to choose, a hard name to pronounce. So
pronounce
Americans say Takao.
Yeah,
it's Takao, right?
Takao. Yeah, Takao.
And so
Takao.
one of the challenges is getting him to say his name correctly, right? To be able to, because it's really because Takao sounds like cow, right? But that's not how you pronounce it, right? It's like
well, that's like my last name. People all my life have
Asakawa.
No, they would say is that Asakawa?
Oh, Asakawa. Yeah, okay.
Asakawa. No, it's not Asakawa. But it's hard when Japanese Americans don't pronounce Japanese correctly. Kind of drives me nuts. Like if they say udon.
Yeah.
Or futon.
Futon.
Yeah, like non-Japanese would say. And I know Japanese Americans aren't Japanese, but Bob Matsui, former congressman, he passed away, and his widow is now a congressperson. Bob Matsui would pronounce his own name Matsui.
Oh, really? That's right. He would.
Yeah.
I remember that.
Yeah. I was like, boy, that used to bug me. I wrote a blog post about it.
Oh, I was at the Mineta airport, and I was listening to the announcements, and I forget how they pronounced it, but I remember the announcement pronounced Mineta wrong.
How do you do that?
I don't remember Mineta. It was just off, and I remember I was going to the bathroom, and I was like, wait, what did I just hear? And then I waited to hear it again, and then I told him, Mineta. I was like, by the way, just to let you know, I don't know what message it was, but they mispronounced your name, and it really bothered me. Like, he's like, why is this guy telling me about?
You probably thought it was funny.
I was like, this is like frightening that like the airport itself, named after this dude, wasn't even named correct. It wasn't even like being pronounced correctly by the whoever's doing the computer. It was probably a computer voice at this point, but it was interesting. But thank you, Gil, so much for coming on, for sharing your wisdom, and thank you everyone for listening. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for putting up with us. This is a long conversation.
It was a long conversation, but that's okay. It's great to have a long conversation. Everybody, please take one of Gil's advice and please let somebody know about it. It's a really great way for us to get out there and tell your friend why you listened or watched the show. And please rate and review and subscribe. And thank you again. And thank you, Gil, again. And thank you, everybody. And have a great night, day.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.